This is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague, Sydney Derrick, our librarian. Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm Sydney Derrick, librarian here at the Historical Society. We are heading back to the Roaring 20s this month with 2 episodes about Dubose and Dorothy Heyward, the Charleston authors and playwrights who were active during the Charleston Renaissance. Dubose was best known for his novel Porgy, which became a play, and then an opera, Porgy and Bess, which was developed by Dorothy and Dubose with Ira and George Gershwin. In this episode, we're talking with Harlan Greene, who recently wrote the book Porgy's Ghost, The Life and Works of Dorothy Heyward and Her Contribution to an American Classic. But before we jump into our conversation, let's hear some announcements. Our Stories Around the State program continues with speaking events upcoming in Chesterfield, Cheraw, and Bennettsville over the next couple of months on a variety of topics related to the American Revolution. Check out the Program and Events tab on our website, schistory.org, to get dates and exact locations. And many items from the Dubose Heyward papers, who we'll talk more about today, have been digitized and are now available on the Lowcountry Digital Library. That website can be accessed for free from anywhere with an internet connection, and the items online include photographs, royalty statements, contracts, letters, scenes that were cut out from the novel and the play, and more. You can view those on the Lowcountry Digital Library's website at lcdl.library.cofc.edu. Harlan Greene is Emeritus Scholar in Residence at the College of Charleston's Addlestone Library and has held many leadership roles in archival organizations around Charleston. In fact, he founded the archives at the Charleston County Public Library and is chair of Charleston's Historical Commission. An award-winning novelist, he also has authored and co-authored several nonfiction works, including Mr. Skylark, John Bennett and the Charleston Renaissance, and Slave Badges and the Slave Hire System in Charleston, South Carolina, 1783 to 1865. We're so excited to talk with him about his latest work on the often overlooked wife of Dubose Heyward, Dorothy, who wrote many of her own works in addition to helping her husband. Harlan Greene, thank you so much for coming on the podcast to talk a little bit about your book. And I wanted to start there. So your book is part biography of Dorothy Heyward. So can you tell us just a little bit about who she was?
And I think that is a necessary question because I think the world has an idea of Dorothy Heyward as being this shadowy person who might have had something to do with an opera called Porgy and Bess. And she's always been in the shadows and relegated to the wife of or the helper of. But Dorothy Heyward, a very courageous, plucky woman born in Ohio. She wants to be an artist. She wants to be a playwright. She's driven to be a playwright. Despite her family, she becomes a playwright. And spending one summer at the McDowell Colony, an artist colony in New Hampshire, she meets a young man who is a poet. And that's Dubose Heyward from Charleston, South Carolina. She's Dorothy Coons from Worcester, Ohio. They meet, they fall in love. It's the first love affair for both. She eventually does come to Charleston. And while she does become very important to Dubose and all of his creative works, she also has many other creative works. She will, by the end of her life, she will have had 7 plays on Broadway and published 2 novels and raised a daughter.
Porgy is probably the book that Dubose Heyward is most known for, and Porgy and Bess being the opera. Can you tell me a little bit about a synopsis of that story?
It is a very short poetic, brilliant novel, and I probably won't match that in my contemplation of it. But it's based on a beggar who cannot walk. He begs. He's living in a place called Catfish Row in downtown Charleston. A murder. He sees a murder in the very opening of the poker game. Crown has murdered somebody. He flees. And in the novel, a few weeks later, this poor gaunt woman named Bess, who is Crown's ex-girlfriend, comes wandering into Catfish Row. And Porgy, being an outsider, being a cripple, feels for another outsider. So he takes her in. They have a very unlikely romance. They both change, as love will do to people. They have many trials, temptations, a hurricane, another murder, variety of dramatic things happening. And spoiler alert, at the end of the novel, Porgy is jailed for a small little misdemeanor, and he's going to be out in a couple of days. But Bess believes that he's going to be in jail forever. So she reverts to her bad ways, and she's disappears and goes off to Savannah. And Porgy comes home. He's had his summer of love and loss, and the classic line ending is he's standing there in an irony of morning sunlight, that this tragic figure has had a brief fling with happiness, and now that's over. But for that summer, he had love. Dorothy, however, being the dramatist and being less prejudiced than Dubose, she's the one who really lifts this story to majestic proportions. When Gershwin's going to set it to music, he's going to make it a completely different thing. And Dorothy does the same thing when she takes it from a novel to a play. Dorothy, as I said, is more liberal. She's lived in New York. She's lived in Boston. She's seen the Great Migration. She has come to Charleston. Her family did not own slaves. She has nothing invested in seeing that African Americans as being inferior to whites. And so then she's also a great dramatist. And so then at the end of this story, when Bess has been whisked away, not to Savannah, but to New York, Porgy does not take defeat. She gives him agency. She allows an African American to say, no, I'm not going to accept the status quo. I'm going to leave this place, and I'm going to look to fulfill my dream. And she specifically says in her play that when Porgy leaves on his impossible journey to New York to look for the woman he loved, that the gates of Catfish Row close shut behind him. She knows that the Southern way of life between whites and blacks is over. So she not only elevates the story to a more grand scale, she also puts it in, a more nuanced way as well too. She knows what's going on, and Porgy's change is reflecting of a larger societal change as well too. So she really is the one that grants not just the character stature, but I think she's the one that makes it a transcendent piece of art.
In the overture of your book, you describe the first time you saw Porgy and Bess performed in Charleston in the 1970s. How was that experience transformative for you?
Well, art and excellent art is transformative, and I do believe it was excellent art, that 1970 production. But for a young man, a high schooler who had never seen an opera before, it was an incredible experience. And this was 1970, and to see a piece of art that was actually also from your hometown really made it much more of a exceptional experience for me, because sure, you could see West Side Story, and that could be a wonderful story, but it's set in New York about in a place that you know nothing of. But to see an incredible piece of music with a dramatic story, and it was told and acted and performed by Charlestonians who I think themselves were also putting an extra inspirational touch into it as well. I think all of that combined bowled over this very unsophisticated audience member.
So Dorothy is traditionally credited with co-authoring the play Porgy, but in your book, you argue that the novel Porgy would also not have come to be without her. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yes, with pleasure. Dubose had been born in Charleston, 1885, 20 years after the Civil War. His father dies soon after his birth, and Dubose is born to a certain tradition. Not only is he the direct descendant of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, he's seen as an aristocrat and as a Southern male aristocrat, and he's the only man in a house of women, his sister, his mother, his grandmother. So Dubose takes duty and his role as a Charleston gentleman very seriously. He wants to be an artist, but he realizes no, he has to support all those women who depend on him. And so he becomes an insurance salesman, allowing himself only to write in the summers when he can get away from the heat of Charleston, back then when all business stopped in the summertime. He marries Dorothy, who's a very emancipated woman who has fought her own family and who has fought gender expectations of her. They did not want her to be a playwright. They said she could not be a playwright, but she had a successful play on Broadway. And I think she taught by example. She could show Dubose that she followed her dream, bucking family expectation. And she basically said to him, I'm not sure in so many words, but Dubose, I can fend for myself. I have been fending for myself. And so if you feel like you have to support your mother and your sister, that's one thing, but you do not have to support me. And I do think it was that push from her showing what an independent artist could do and not assuming that she was going to be a barnacle on his side and slow him down that really allowed him. And literally, she said the one asset that they had was a small little house on Church Street. And she said, sell that house. We do not need it. And with that money, selling it, he felt confident enough to be able to take off enough time from work to write the manuscript that does become the novel Porgy.
What was the reaction in Charleston to that? Because I would imagine that for the time, a woman having those thoughts was progressive.
She really was progressive, and she hid it very well. She was very diminutive. She always looked younger than she was. And because of she never really had a youth of her own because she had to take care of ailing family members, she sort of presented as like someone with arrested development. She was very slight, very slender. And so people, I don't think, took her seriously. But it's only when the book came out, when they saw that Dubose Heyward, who had been lauded for his beautiful lyrical poetry, celebrating the beauties of the Low Country, the local legends and lore of the Low Country, all of a sudden he had abandoned the white elite, or so the white elite thought, and he was going to the gutter, as they called it, to make a hero out of a odiferous black beggar who couldn't walk. And so then they were really startled. They felt betrayed. Many people did in the city of Charleston. And then they thought, well, what's the difference? Why 2 or 3 years ago, Dubose was writing these nice, placid, praiseworthy things. And now is he doing this? What's the change? And the change was Dorothy.
Oh, wow. I've mentioned this to you before, but I've always associate Dorothy Heyward and Zelda Fitzgerald in my mind because both were writers in their own right, whose husbands also wrote, and to many more accolades, really. So what are your thoughts on that comparison?
Well, I mean, I think it's more compare and contrast. The interesting thing is that both The Great Gatsby and Porgy come out in the year 1925. So they do share that, and to some extent, both of them are epic-making, and they also make the name for the young authors. Zelda, I think, matched herself to Scott, and I think Dorothy matched herself to Dubose. But in that way, I think that's where maybe any kind of similarity ends. Gatsby and I think Scott Fitzgerald thought of himself as the icon of the age, and he felt like he had to live the Roaring Twenties, which he was showing in his novels. And Dubose Heyward, as I said earlier, was a Charleston gentleman. So he was not going to have the public life that Scott and Zelda had. And Dorothy was a very private person as well, too. She was actually much more liberal than her husband was. And I think that's one thing that she shared with Zelda. Dorothy was a suffragette. Dorothy was very modern in her views about race, but she knew that she had to be sort of protective coloration in the city of Charleston. So while they were a writing couple, and coincidentally, spoiler alert, one thing they do share in common too, which is really kind of tragic, is that, Zelda goes mad by the end of her life, and Dorothy actually does undergo a period of what we would call madness or a nervous breakdown, that she actually, Dorothy herself ends up in a mental institution, being treated with electroconvulsive therapy, which she does survive and settle down through. So maybe that's one facile comparison. It was not Dorothy's I think, genetic nature that drove her mad or resulted in her nervous breakdown. It was the way she was treated by the men of her time period. And by that, I do not mean Dubose. I mean producers and a variety of people like that.
After Porgy, much later, Dorothy writes a play called Set My People Free about Denmark Vesey, who was accused and sentenced to death for inciting a slave rebellion back in 1822. Now, in your book, you write that although the play was rewritten several times, Vesey remained a heroic leader and martyr. Now, that seems a unique take for the time. I would imagine that most white people at the time would have considered him a monster because the plan was supposedly to kill enslavers and their families. But what can you tell me about that play and how it went?
So Dorothy was helping Dubose write an essay for a book by the Spiritual Society, and he had to write a book about the Low Country Negro. And Dorothy was doing his research for him, and then she discovered the story buried in a footnote. This would have been about 1930, when Denmark Vesey was not well known. She discovers the story of Denmark Vesey in a footnote, and Dorothy loved to tell the tale that she and Dubose turned to each other and they said, "This is going to be our next play." So Dubose Heyward did start it. He had to abandon it when he started working with Gershwin on Porgy and Bess. Dubose dies in 1940, but meanwhile, Dorothy has gone ahead and she's writing this play. And she goes on the record of basically saying, nobody has heard of Denmark Vesey, but I, Dorothy Heyward, think he's one of the most heroic African Americans, who ever lived. And she sees the dramatic possibilities of it. It's performed or read at the MacDowell Colony. Pulitzer Prize winning playwright Thornton Wilder hears it and says this is a marvelous piece of work. And it's actually set to be produced in 1941, exactly when World War I breaks out. And so Denmark Vesey, to some extent, becomes a fatality of that because all of a sudden the United States is at war, and the idea of Dorothy writing about a race war back in the 1820s does not seem patriotic enough for the war effect. So the play is, it was going into production, the play is abandoned, and many people take options on it. They suggest write it this way, write it that way. And as a dramatist, she can't help but see as well that one of the most interesting sides of it is also the fellow George Wilson, who she takes as the person who betrayed the plot. She can well understand and dramatize why a formerly enslaved person, Denmark Vesey, won his freedom, why he would fight for his people. But why would an enslaved person turn against his own people to save his white master? So I think as time went on, she started to see multiple viewpoints. And as one producer changed and one director changed, she was encouraged to examine and go down each rabbit hole. So the play that she eventually writes is kind of a divided point of view. She never takes it away from Vesey being a hero, but she does like to set the question up. Was he power mad? And was George Wilson an Uncle Tom? And interesting thing is, it's produced on Broadway not until about 1948. The country is completely different back then. We actually things that happened in South Carolina, the blinding of Isaac Woodard, a black serviceman coming back to South Carolina and being blinded for not obeying the what whites expect of him. So there's a totally different mood going on in the country as well. And as people say, although the play does not last long on Broadway, the critics say this is an incredibly intelligent piece of writing. We have not seen anything like this on Broadway in years. And I think while the play is flawed, it was not fatally flawed, but the audience just did not want to hear it. She was ahead of her time, and Broadway audiences they wanted light fare after World War II. They did not want serious racial investigations that made them uncomfortable, and that play made them uncomfortable.
What was Dorothy's life like after Dubose died? I mean, I would imagine, she's not from South Carolina, and I would imagine it wasn't super hospitable to outsiders at the time. And I'm sure also she was traveling. But tell me a little bit about what her life was like after that.
So Dubose dies suddenly in the June 1940. He's 55 years old. Dorothy is 5 years younger or so. She does have her best friend as Josephine Pinckney. They've actually bought a house on the Battery. So she has been belonging. And Dubose wanted to return to Charleston to raise their daughter, Jennifer. Jennifer was maybe 7 when her father died. Dorothy basically had to rent the house on the Battery and rent the house on Folly Beach to keep it together. Jennifer eventually wants to go off and be a dancer, so Jennifer is sent off to boarding school, and Dorothy basically flits from apartment to apartment in New England or New York, coming down periodically to Charleston. But then she's trying to raise Jennifer. She's not left a lot of money. She is in demand as a playwright, so not only writing the play about Denmark Vesey, she's called in right at the beginning of World War I to adapt a play again, that has very strong racial themes about a African American and a white merchant seaman that are their ship is lost in the Pacific. A white man and a black man wash up on an island in the South Pacific, and it's captured by the Japanese. But the black man can blend in and look like a native, and the white person can't. And the black man is put in the position of, should I defend a country that did not defend me? So again, she's writing this play, she's writing Denmark Vesey, but the rest of her life really is going to be working for Dubose. Although the opera premiered in 1935, Porgy and Bess did not do particularly well. In 1942, 2 years after Dubose's death, the opera is revived, and that's when it begins its transcendent rise to become the worldwide phenomenon that it would become within a decade or so. And those people who revive it are much more impressed with the Gershwin name than the Heyward name. And they literally, Cheryl Crawford, the producer in 1942, literally illegally drops Dubose Heyward's name off the opera. And Dorothy does everything for the rest of her life to get her husband's name back on the opera. And in so doing so, she wipes her own fingerprints off the opera. She knew that the opera was always going to be a great work of art. Dubose actually doubted that anything that is going to be heard from again. But she had been so happy with her life in Dubose and so devoted to him that that's what she devoted the rest of her life to, is making sure that it was always known as an opera by Dubose, Heyward, and George Gershwin. And if Dorothy's name was left off, that was fine with her.
That's interesting. And I wonder, too, by making sure that his was on there, she was helping his legacy, which could help her as she was still living, and then potentially their daughter, too. As long as there was a Heyward name attached to it somewhere, it would leave, it would help everyone, I guess.
I think that's a valid view, but my perception of Dorothy, I really do think she was selfless for a number of reasons. As I said, although she was a suffragette, she had spent her youth taking care of other people. And it's interesting if you actually look at the opera itself. I like to draw the parallels between Dorothy and Bess. Bess triggers the entire action of the opera, and Bess's disappearance at the end of the opera. She disappears by the end of the opera. Dorothy triggered the whole story of Porgy and Bess by her letting her husband write, by her dramatizing it, and she ends up disappearing from the story. But another similarity, and maybe the stronger similarity to stress here, is that in the opera itself, Bess is always building up her man. And Dorothy, to some extent, was doing that as well, too. People often don't realize that there was some kind of secret kinship between Dubose Heyward and Sammy Smalls, the character, the real-life character that he based his character Porgy on. Sammy Smalls had polio and was a cripple. Dubose Heyward hid the fact that his arm was disfigured by polio very, very well. So, and in the opera, there's a wonderful line, when God make cripple, he make him to be lonesome. And I think Dubose himself probably felt alienated to some extent. Here he was cast as the man in the family, but he was not a virile presence. He could not physically do a lot. And Dorothy built him up. Dorothy was willing to surrender her own name. She was so self-confident. She knew what she did. She did not need to prove it by anyone else, whether it was she was giving into male chauvinism or whether she was deferring to the social expectation of the women of the day. I don't really know, but I do realize that there was a very selfless gene in her. And I think because Dubose died so young, she took any slur on him, she took it incredibly personally. And even in the opera, and in the play in particular, there is one scene where someone's saying something bad about Porgy, and Bess just rips into them. And I think Dorothy was to some extent just like that too. She was totally devoted to him. And just to repeat, she didn't care a fig of what people thought of her. But the idea of dissing her husband, no, she was not going to stand for that.
That's such an interesting concept, because I think she sounds like such a feminist. And so you would think some of these things she would sort of rail against some of society's expectations, but that she was so confident in herself that she did not need to concern herself with either society's expectations or, this maybe more feminist point of view, that she was just doing what came naturally to her in defending her husband and in fighting for him.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there is a contradiction there. But as Dubose wrote to her in some of the courtship letters, which are in the papers of the South Carolina Historical Society, he asked Dorothy, "Are you ever going to be able to say anything bad about anybody?" She had strong opinions, but she kept them to herself. And it was only when she got angry that she would tell the truth. And so then, when she got angry about something, then she would write it down, what she thought about it. But again, she also felt maybe she and Dubose were very similar. They even said that they looked like brother and sister. So there's a puzzling thing that in September of 1935, we think the opera premiered in October. Its first tryouts in Boston. When there's people in the audience screaming, "Heyward, Heyward, Heyward," Dubose refused to go up on the stage and take credit for it. And so then there's something about, and we don't know why, and there's something about Dorothy too. She was very hesitant to take credit for something. She always said, when the play was first written, Dubose said, "I don't even need my name on the play because you wrote the majority of it." She insisted that his name get put on the play. It started out being copyrighted by Dorothy and Dubose Heyward. It ended up being performed by and credited to Dubose and Dorothy Heyward. So there was something in her makeup which I, as a biographer, can only document. Mm-hmm. I can't really understand. I can see her doing it, but I'm not her psychoanalyst. Right. I don't know why she did it. And it's very puzzling, but that makes her an interesting character to me.
Well, you mentioned the papers there, so let's talk a little bit about those. So you were working at the South Carolina Historical Society when the papers of Dorothy and Dubose first or were donated to the archive. So what was that like going through them for the first time?
Yeah, if I could even go back a little bit
Oh, yeah.
before, a story that I often repeat. I actually owe my entire career as an archivist to the papers of Dubose Heyward because as a young researcher researching something else, I went into the Fireproof building in the 1970s, not long after I'd initially seen the opera, and saw a collection of Dubose Heyward's works on the shelves. And long story short, I was offered a volunteer position by the then director, Mrs. Granville Pryor. Did I want to process those papers? I had no idea what that meant, but 50 years later, I've had a career as an archivist. So Dubose's papers had been there, and I'd already gone through those and had processed them, made available to researchers, had written a little bit about the opera. But then when Dorothy and Dubose's daughter, Jennifer, died in the 1980s, then the rest of the papers came in. And that was a wonderful experience. When Dorothy had died in 1961, her daughter had died 20-some years later. The daughter, Jennifer, had had no children. And obviously, people settling the estate had rifled through Dorothy's papers, trying to find anything of value that they could sell. But Dorothy, Lord love her, was a little absent-minded, so she stuck things in the wrong folders. So when the folders appeared to be empty, no, it was just stuck somewhere else. But I will say, going through those papers, that's what started this biography, because in those papers and in an unfinished autobiography, left undone at her death, and in letters that she wrote that she never sent, that's when I started seeing an alternate version of the story. That's where the truth came out. You could see how much Dorothy had done to create the play, to keep Dubose's name in front of the audience while she herself erased herself. You can see her telling bold lies in her autobiography, saying it happened this way, it happened that way. But looking at other materials, and that's the beauty of primary materials, you can see, no, it did not happen this way, it happened that way. And whether she forgot it, I think she was a storyteller and she did want to please people. So she told them anecdotes which they believed. And that's our job as archivists and historians, is to set the record straight.
Well, and speaking of that process, can you talk a little bit about your research process for the book? And were there any unanswered questions that you wish the records had the answers to?
Well, I do wish I could understand why Dorothy did what she did, why she deliberately hid her materials. But I'll do the reverse of the question. The great thing in there is I inferred that at some point she had a nervous breakdown. And when she had a nervous breakdown, she had electroconvulsive therapy, which disconnects your synapses and you're forgetful. And then the doctor suggested that she start writing things down. And that's where the truth came out. It's almost as if she's speaking to herself. She's writing things down and saying, I did this, I did that. Dubose said this, Dubose said that. And because they were so fragmented and scrambled, I think maybe that's one reason other researchers did not look at them, because she's repeating this paragraph 3 or 4 times. She's really trying to get her mind in order. So that was a wonderful find. Things that are missing that I would love to know why. Apparently, we don't know exactly how George Gershwin first contacted Dubose Heyward. We have a variety of stories. Interestingly, Dorothy kept all of Dubose's love letters. Dubose did not keep Dorothy's love letters. So there were things that were missing, but there were things that turned up too. It was interesting that in the papers of the South Carolina Historical Society was an old photostat, before they had photocopies, of a contract. The opera premieres in October of 35. This contract with the Theater Guild is dated like June or July of 35, a few months before the opera begins, and it's not signed. During the writing of this book, the original of that contract came up for auction. Unfortunately, it went for over $17,000, but there was the smoking gun that George Gershwin, Ira Gershwin, Dubose Heyward, and Dorothy Heyward all signed the contract, and they were all listed as co-authors of the opera. And there was the missing piece of evidence that George Gershwin knew it. Ira Gershwin knew it. The Theater Guild knew it. Everybody knew that Dorothy was. And Dorothy actually had double the amounts of royalties that Ira did in the creation of the opera. So there was an archival piece of evidence to prove that in 1935, everyone knew this open secret, which Dorothy wanted to conceal, and that's the piece that's missing. But I don't think she ever wrote it down. It was just second nature to her.
Now that the Heyward papers are being digitized and will be available for anyone with internet access to look through and to do that similar research, what do you hope other people realize about Dorothy or Dubose, either one?
Well, that they don't have to take our word for it. Every generation reinterprets history in their own eyes. They're going to see things that we don't see. We're blinded by our time period and our prejudices. And that's the wonderful thing, is that people will be able to look at it for themselves. They won't have to do it through a filter of my biography. They can check my footnotes to see if I was correct, to see if I quoted things correctly. But it will be, everybody's Dubose Heyward, everybody's Porgy, everybody's Dorothy Heyward. And so then that unfiltered coordination and cooperation and touching of the past is one thing that digitization allows. And so then people will reinterpret it. People will see things that no one else saw. That's the great thing about making them accessible.
Well, thank you so much, Harlan, for joining us. This was wonderful to talk to you about the book.
Well, thank you so much. And I couldn't have done it without the Historical Society.
And thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you back here in 2 weeks on May 25th for our interview with our metadata specialist, Annette Guild. She has been working on digitizing the Dubose Heyward papers so that they're available to research online. So we'll talk more with her about that process and some of her favorite items from the collection. We'll see you then.